Right, so you've sat in three groups. The three groups looking at remuneration systems, sort of old model, how to make the old model better, and then sort of varying degrees of radicalism about new models in groups 1, 2, and 3. What we're going to do is we've got a chairperson of each group or someone involved in each of those three groups to just give a quick summary. I mean, sort of 3-4 minute summary of what that the themes that that group might have focused on or uncovered. I'll then get any of you who want to comment on what the chairperson from your group has said and disagree or add to it, and then we can begin to draw things to a close. So, well, you've met Martin Telling already, CFO of Omnicom Media Group, so the media agency side. Martin was chairing that first group. So Martin, take us through the themes that you want to draw out.
So we talked about time-based remuneration, keeping with the old model, but making it work better. First of all, Janet Markwick, for those of you who know her, Janet, she's COO of Grey on the creative side, but ex-client side, someone I used to negotiate with, so she knows both sides of the fence. She very kindly shared the model that they're working on within Grey and have been working on for 4 or 5 years with clients, which basically recognise the fact that the existing time-based model, based on a pitch, costing it out in very simple terms with very low understanding at that stage of scope of works is inefficient. So she recommended a 2-stage approach that clients firstly decide kind of agency you need to work with, understand some basic parameters about hourly rates, but then within the first 100 days of that relationship, expand on that understanding to work and develop a detailed scope of work that works on the structure together with the client, a 2-way process that takes into account things like historical knowledge that the client has and the agency has, what the client's KPIs and plans for the future are, and assumptions where you have to fill in the gaps, basically. And I think Janet summed it up nicely by saying it's better to get 70% of something rather than 100% of nothing. Is that fair, Janet? So, and some people fed back to it at 100 days felt a bit long. A client's brave enough to make a decision on an agency and then sort of go into a 100-day approach. It doesn't have to be 100 days. It could be just 3 days. You can sort of do it on a speed basis. But you've got to get everyone into a room and share what's required to thrash out that scope of work. And then David Weeks and Alan Thompson from Mondelez and Haystack, who've worked together on a model that is exactly this, that David explained is currently just their digital benchmarking tool for what they use on digital benchmarking on their EMEA digital roster. It covers about 8 million euros of spend, I think. Is that right, David?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But it's been successful and they're looking to roll it out further. And it's basically a 3-step process where marketing prepare a budget and they set their ambitions that they share with the agency. The agency then responds with an inputs estimate in terms of roles, hours. So it comes back to that link to inputs. And then the marketer receives that final summary with output costs. And there's a sense check. Sometimes that might be too low and there is an iterative, there's a trust there that's an iterative process that everyone agrees and goes in open eyes into what that would be. So we then sort of asked the group to debate what they thought about that process compared to the legacy systems that we had. And Evan, you asked me to summarize that in about 3 points, and I wrote down about 20. But in terms of the opportunities and benefits, I think people were very positive, very cup-half-full in terms of what the opportunities were. They saw that it focused the conversation. They saw that even though it's a big old spreadsheet that Janet has to do this, in its essence, it is simple. It helps and reminds agencies of what their cost structure is. And it's, I think people maybe observed that it's working in Mondelez in digital and it might be better for those sort of activities for standard tasks. But I think we can challenge that, and I think it can apply to many things. But it certainly gets client-agency alignment and the partnership in terms of shared responsibility. In terms of what the barriers might be, how we'd need to overcome those, it comes down to establishing a proper scope of work, but that's where we started anyway. So, it comes back to Janet's point about 70% of something is better than 100% of nothing. Is it too input focused? Well, sort of it is. It goes against the grain of the outputs and outcomes. It doesn't reward value, but it does address the sentiment this morning that actually we are a time-based business, and that is going to be essentially the majority of our revenues for the foreseeable future, but it improves upon that. Could it be too time-consuming? I think the reality is, and David Webby talked about agencies' addiction to pitching and the amount of time we spend on pitching, but we don't spend enough time on scope of work and the fees that relate to that. So that's something we need to address. And then how we move forward, suggestions were that we try and link it to the emotional contracts with clients or ways of working. We need more case studies. Janet's got a number of case studies, and it's great that she's willing to share those. We need more case studies like this in the industry. We need to celebrate success, I guess. We also need more benchmarks in terms of what those processes should cost.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone who was in that group want to add or subtract from what Martin has said? No? Fair summary? Okay. And Martin, do you personally, you feel it's kind of worth breathing life into this old model, the input model? I mean, this morning in the first session, I got the feeling there were quite a lot of people
defending the undefendable.
Who had some enthusiasm for the way it runs, and if you took away the kind of giving business away for free through pitching...
If it's not broke, then don't fix it. But, you know, I do think there is scope for this. You know, if every agency is out there making great margins on a time-based model, then go for it. And if they have 100% trust and transparency with their clients as to what that inputs model is based on. But I think, you know, talking to procurement, as we've engaged with people like Deborah in this process, they want to better understand it. They want, you know, the educated procurement people in this room want to see their agencies being successful, profitable, but they want to know that they're getting proper value for money. And you know, we came up against, once Janet's process really delves into the detail, and you know, how many briefs can a client give you? And if it says 3 briefs and then the client gives you five briefs, do you start overcharging for that? Well, at least you've identified the problem, and then you can address it. This is an iterative process, which is based on a long-term relationship with the client, not just here's the price of the pitch and you go away and you never ever talk about it. So I think it encourages positive behaviour on both sides.
I mean, it is very interesting because it is not dissimilar to I keep coming back to this construction contract, the NEC 3, but the essence of it is literally at the end of each day working out whether anything has changed on the next day's programme or the future work. So if there's a change in spec, at the end of the day, it is costed and no work can proceed until that's been reabsorbed. And if there's an unforeseen problem, you encounter a bit of rock that you weren't expecting to be there, that is costed and factored in and shared before the work proceeds. So you have people sitting around managing the contract as you go. And there is a lot to be said for learning, I mean, whether it's input or output, it's that you don't sign off the end of the deal until you've got some way into it, because you're learning, is it always the top guy who's actually using up his time on this, or is it always, can we get away with the cheaper people on this project? Yeah, go on. Yeah.
One of the things
Sorry, I was actually looking behind, but I've got wonky eyes, so it always looks like I'm looking at the wrong person. You go, and then we'll let them on.
Okay. One of the things we did postulate within our session, but probably didn't discuss quite as deeply as we should have done, was the idea of developing an industry-wide database of what costs might be. And to your point, Evan, that would allow us to build up a sense of reassurance that a budget was fit for purpose before we got started. And then if changes were made along the way, you could assess whether the change was proportionate to the original budget or whatever. And it just give everybody a little bit more reassurance, I think, that these numbers aren't just gathered out of thin air. There is a basis on which there's an understanding of the scope of work and the number of people and level of talent that is needed to deliver that scope of work.
You want to be able to pluck numbers out of thin air a little bit, don't you, to kind of wiggle up the numbers?
Well, to start with, maybe you do, but they should be based on some intelligent assumptions.
Just pass the microphone back to Janet. Whoop, sorry. Sorry, don't worry, just carry on.
Or a time-based model is as much an output-based model as an input. You know, if you start with a scope of work, you're actually defining all the outputs that you want. And as we showed today, you know, once you start to understand what all of the individual scope of works or projects that you're required to do are, you can start to gather together how you measure them and what all the KPIs of those things are. So I don't see time as purely input. I see it as a way to articulate outputs and also how you demonstrate the value of each of those outputs.
So if you're taking into account the output of the hour that you're charging for, then you've kind of blurred the boundary between input and output.
Or the outputs of the projects. You know, when you start with a scope of work, you haven't even started to begin calculating hours. What you start to do is create a dialogue about the behaviours, the ways of working, and what you want out of it. And out of that comes hours. So actually, sometimes I think scope of work equals output, and then what you end up with is hours.
Right. Okay, well, that's very helpful. Let's move on to the second group who went a step further and looked at value-based remuneration schemes. Now, Deborah Cornwall's going to talk us through this, and Deborah is from procurement, everybody, head of marketing, FM and retail procurement at EE, and is obviously a good procurement person because she's on the ISBA Compag group. ISBA. Take us through group 2, Deborah.
Well, first of all, my group, I think, could have carried on the Q&A for at least a further hour. We ended up having quite an energetic conversation with lots of people wanting to ask questions and debating various points with one another. Out of my 6 tables, there were definitely some clear themes that basically came out. And I think one of the most important ones is to acknowledge that marketing is an investment, but we need to make sure it's sustainable, incremental investment. So that was a very strong message that came out of the agencies. And one thing that would help with that sustainable element is the longevity of the contract. So for a lot of us in the room, and I use the collective word, contracts may be a year or 2 years, but the message came across very loud and clear that 3 years in a creative contract, sometimes the media ones are obviously of that length is important. So stronger, aligned relationships, making sure that the senior guys meet on a regular basis, that the PBRs are planned and reviewed on a very regular basis, and making sure that everybody had a vested interest in the end result, that the end result was very strong, and that the upside was clear for both sides. So strong benchmarks, regular reviews, good contracts. Again, as I say, consistent message from all the tables. What was quite, actually, I found almost a bit disappointing in us as advertisers was another strong message that came through, that actually you as agencies feel like some of the marketing fraternity don't have enough business information, that they're not close enough to the business objectives, and that's why you often don't have that information. So again, I was quite surprised at hearing some of that, but it was a consistent theme that came across. And obviously it's key for you to be really aligned, for you to understand what the KPIs are, what the measures are of the business. We talked this morning about the big business challenges. If you're not at that table, if you don't know what those are, then obviously the end result is compromised, and we will accept that. We also talked about innovation, and there were some quite interesting ideas that we discussed. And when it comes to fee structure, one of the tables suggested for the PBR element, why don't the advertisers pay 100%? And if the campaign doesn't work, then obviously they refund some of the money. So again, I don't know if anybody in the room's ever tried that, but it was something
challenge sometimes when you've delivered everything and then the client says, sorry, but I haven't got a budget to pay you with.
Yeah.
So
that's unforgivable as far as I'm
yeah.
concerned. The budget
How do you ring fence that money?
No, but it needs to be ring fenced by finance.
So we'll happily take the money and put it in the bank and then give it back to you is the point.
That was one idea. Something else that, again, several tables mentioned was you retaining ownership of the IP. So that was, again, something that other industries are mentioned, but in the creative environment, in the marketing services industry, we as advertisers obviously own the IP, we pay for that IP. So that was something that was up for debate. Something else that was discussed was being paid in shares, so the client shares, which, again, we didn't really have time to discuss any great detail, but it was something that was suggested as an idea. So long-term relationships, lots of contact, pitches we didn't really discuss in too great a detail, if any. And the long-term relationship is key because trust is fundamental. And none of us are going to move this conversation forward unless we break the cycle and start to trust one another. And spending time in one another's companies was also a suggestion. So, God forbid, let procurement in for a day to sit at the agency table and really understand what goes on. Likewise, the agencies come into marketing and really understand what goes on. So we need to start thinking about how to do things differently. We've been talking about some of this for a few years now. And, people, Coco obviously have, taken step change, P&G to a certain extent. But for the rest of us, it's very easy to maintain the status quo. So,
would you, Deborah? Are you comfortable with 3-year contracts, or does that feel like you're tied in and you may find that you don't like?
I think if there's a break for convenience clause, a lot changes, and obviously Orange and T-Mobile coming together was a classic to form EE, and the business strategy, often dictates the length of the contract, as does the legal department. So in principle, I'm not adverse to it. I think if procurement absolutely understands the end goal and the benefits that can be achieved by a longer contract, then I think it's absolutely a conversation.
That came up a lot on the first of the first A of Adapt was the alliances and the kind of the promiscuity of one night stands with the advertisers was much criticised. Anybody from Group 2 wanting to just add to that? Yeah, we've got a microphone just to chuck over this way. Is it Mike? Was that it? Yeah.
Yeah, forgive me, Deborah. It was just a refinement of the point about longer contracts. The issue was, in fact, that whilst a 2 or 3 year contract might be awarded, there would be very often an at-will termination clause of 1 or 2 months within that on the client side, and that was felt to be an inhibitor to some of the value-based remuneration opportunities, because you then get into the sort of tortuous element of, if you're terminated, how do you protect the value-based component that you've put at risk, etc., etc. So that was one of the contract points that we, certainly in our table, were concerned about as it being an inhibitor to value-based remuneration.
As soon as you give someone a get-out clause, it can be...
Mike, I would never... I mean, months is ridiculous.
Well, you'd be surprised.
You don't need to talk about shares, by the way, because you could talk about share options for this reward thing, where then you don't actually give away chunks. Effectively, you only give away value above a certain value, if it triggers above a certain level, and that's... if you want to incentivize people with shares, options are normally the...
I'm not actually sure what kind of incentive that is, because obviously, it's
so much else in the share price.
Taking Tesco's as an example, I mean,
as a finance director, it's hard to actually sort of take those to the P&L, and I've had that suggested before, and it comes back to, was it Dominic's suggestion about, the weather and whatever, is your result, is what you, the agency, do really determining share price? It might be an exception. We had Nigel Gilbert address the IPA sort of council recently, and with something like TSB, flotation, then I can see, sort of an idea like that in that situation. But in a steady state for a company's share price, then you really need to be long term, don't you?
I think there was also some crossover, I think, from what you were saying, Deborah, in kind of discussion in our group, because I think shares in this instance might be in a startup as opposed to equity, as opposed to, kind of a share in a startup or equity, as opposed to, so there's a bunch of discussion about that.
Yeah, it's when the company doesn't have cash to pay, they give you shares.
Yeah.
Well, look, let's go on to our third group, which is called risk-based remuneration. That's the title, but it is, in a sense, those slightly more exotic ways, owning your product and perhaps renting it to the client, or having a JV, or any number of things. And Nigel Vaz, who's the MD of Sapient Nitro, was in that group, and can talk us through that, Nigel.
Yeah, sure. So I think we started the conversation kind of with an interesting kind of I think, kind of journey from value on to kind of beyond value, if you will. And we had a couple of really interesting kind of stimulus kind of ideas from Wayra, which is an incubator kind of run by O2 and kind of Simon Devonshire, and then what BBH are doing with ZAG, and of course some of what we're doing at Sapient Nitro. Kind of a couple themes kind of I pull out right at the top. So if you think about the models, they span all the way from what would traditionally be value, so performance-related pay, that I'm sure your group talked about, all the way to kind of co-investment models, be they JVs or licensing, or indeed taking a stake or equity in whatever it is that you're proposing, to starting to think about more interesting ways in which both the kind of client and the agency can kind of benefit from kind of an acceleration of value beyond certain kind of thresholds. So, you know, a bunch of conversation, I think, started around this notion of kind of culture and where, you know, kind of clients find themselves and where agencies find themselves and where value is derived from. This was particularly interesting, I think, because if you think about kind of traditional remuneration models, you know, there is a need for if it's not broken, why fix it? And I think there was a big kind of sense in our kind of conversation in our group that there is a lot of change afoot as clients. There are a lot more options available, be they incubators like Wera, who are having conversations about connecting the startup community through technology and kind of other creative startups directly into businesses. And so kind of what role do agencies play in that context? And I think there was a sense that agencies are the guardians of kind of the long-term kind of consumer, you know, kind of arc that most brands have with consumers, guardians of the kind of business strategy. There was also a lot of conversation around some assumptions, I think, that the agency space typically kind of begins with, that IP is always owned or transferred to a client, and actually, you know, kind of valuing that IP sometimes is much harder for a client to do because the default assumption is, well, we just own it because that's what we're kind of paying you for. And there were some interesting examples of where that has actually you know, not been the case, and exponential value's been created at no detriment to the client, but indeed to kind of the agency. You know, lots of conversation around, I think, culture of, you know, kind of what the agency is looking to seek to create value in outside of their ordinary day-to-day relationships. So, you know, in the case of some of the examples we were discussing, if there's a client who's paying you to solve problem X and that's part of your day-to-day activity, what other challenges are those businesses willing to spend money to kind of solve problems around that they're not talking to you or indeed anybody for, that you have the opportunity to identify and start to put a real kind of stake in the ground about what skin in the game you as an agency can kind of put toward that. You know, lots of conversation around, I mean, there was an interesting conversation about how one might fund some of these activities, because there was a theme around perhaps creative agencies not necessarily having the dollars to invest or the pounds to invest. In one kind of discussion thread in our group was R&D tax credits, because we had a bunch of you know, kind of accounting folks in the conversation who kind of suggested that might be an interesting angle to get money back from the government when you're actually doing kind of R&D work to justify kind of innovation spending. And I think the biggest shift for me was one of kind of the culture. So the culture of I get paid to kind of do job X, which is fast getting commoditized, to here are the opportunities for value that we see, and here's how you can quantifiably measure that value client such that there is a win-win for both parties in actually going at that problem. And I think it was kind of you know, pretty clear that there were some of those problems which are on the low end of the spectrum, which are you can just afford to take a bet, you know, because it's small enough to do. And then there are others which are probably at the other end of the spectrum, which require a large amount of kind of investment and a business case and a lot of thinking about how to structure the return. The hard part is for kind of everything in the middle, where clients perhaps aren't willing to take a bet because it's a big enough sum of money that they care, but not so big that they want a whole bunch of due diligence kind of put into their data and their analytics. And then, of course, there was a long thread about the ability to see the data from a client, because if the risk and the reward are weighted towards the back end of something, effectively the agency becomes a mechanism to fund the client's cash flow, because you have almost zero outlay, and you know, kind of, you know, 18 months from now we'll see if we delivered X result, and then maybe we'll kind of, you know, you'll get that return. So thinking about more structured environments like JVs, where it is not actually about whether the finance person has flagged it in the budget or not, but it is a joint objective which a client's getting some benefit from, but the agency could perhaps take that IP and kind of, you know, reuse it elsewhere to gain exponential benefit.
Does anybody from that group want to comment on? Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. I think there are a couple of other things we talked about that were quite useful. One of them was looking at the client base and saying you need to take a portfolio approach and look at it. This isn't a one-size-fits-all. You need to have low risk, medium risk, and then you could put some high risk in, and you start by looking at your client base. If you go for a more risk-based remuneration approach, the agency needs to learn how to manage that risk. And typically, what that means is becoming more business-like. You're going to have more robust conversations about how money is paid and what the criteria are. and therefore learning how to manage that risk and being very business-like about it is utterly key.
Right.
Yeah, I think on that latter point, I think the one point to probably tease out there, I think there was a conversation about you have to be clear about what you're in the business of. Because if you're in the business of kind of venture capital and investing, that's a very different business than being an agency. So I think we kind of said, if you're using it as a way to generate greater returns to be in the agency business, that's one idea. But I think there was a whole notion that the capital markets world and incubation and venture capital is a far cry from kind of an everyday business of an agency. So I think your kind of point on the portfolio was kind of understanding those kind of thresholds of investment, but also understanding, kind of what you're in the business of getting a return for.
I think that's all very useful. And I think, the idea that you have a portfolio is useful. You don't have to bet the farm on one style or one form. And that was Tim, what was his name? Tim Williams from the US's point. I think that is very useful. And the other thing that he said, though, that none of you have quite addressed, which I just think was interesting, was about offering, if you're the agency, offering the client a menu of choices, of structuring it and saying, look, there's this one, or there's this one, or there's this one. Does that appeal? Maybe, Deborah, that's a question for you on the client side. Does that work if an agency came and said, look, we can do this one of 2 or 3 ways?
Absolutely. I think it's a conversation that we would be very open to. And again, I think depending on what the marketing activity, I see that working less for, say, media than it would for maybe digital or some of the creative spend. But no, absolutely, I'd be delighted.
How many people in this room, having heard the day's proceedings, okay, I'm trying to frame a vote here that is a show of hands vote, that is, how many people here, having heard the day's proceedings, are convinced it would be a good thing for their company to move some way away from pure time-based remuneration to, wait, I haven't finished. Away from that towards the other two. Okay, so to move just a little bit away from Martin towards the other. How many of you are convinced that would be a good thing to some degree or other? And how many of you at the end of this day basically think it isn't broken, I want to stick with good time-based fees where we're sort of comfortable where we are? So a couple of hands, one hand. One hand actually. I said a couple, so you didn't feel so lonely, but there was one hand. So it is actually there's a sort of degree of consensus that there's something to explore here. I mean, my own take on it is when you look at a change, there are 2 types of change. Okay, there's the fax machine type and the mobile phone type, and I'll explain the difference. The fax machine, it makes no sense for you to be the only person in town with a fax machine because there's no one to communicate on it. But it does make sense for you to be the only person in town with a mobile phone because you can at least you can be mobile talking to people on their landlines. So there are 2 types of change. There's the one that you as an individual can affect regardless of what everybody else does. And there's the other type which you as an individual can't do unless everybody else does it as well. I've been trying this afternoon to just think in my head, is the sort of journey that you want to take, is this a journey that makes sense for individuals to take on their own, regardless of whether anyone else does it? Or is this a kind of journey that is only going to work if the whole room gets up and sets off on that path? And I can see reasons why it might be like the fax machine, it's very difficult to do on your own. I mean, it may be that individual agencies would feel they'd look a bit weird if they came up with proposals for different remuneration. It may be that clients would be suspicious of them if they came up with ideas for charging that are different from the industry norm. And it may be that clients would think they're trying to get one over me or they're trying to charge me more. But having listened to it, I don't buy any of that. I mean, I think there's nothing to stop each of you on your own just going to clients and saying, we'd like to do it a different way. I was saying to Ian earlier, the first thing you could do is just say to the client, just spend 10 minutes watching a video which is on the IPA website by this guy, Tim Williams from the US. Just watch it for 10 minutes, and then let's just talk about whether we want to structure our deal in a way like they're doing or whether you want to stick to the traditional model. And I actually think you probably look good if you go to the client and say, we'd like to do it slightly differently, folks. We'd like to have some skin in the game. We don't just want to charge by the hour. We sometimes find our hours are more productive than other hours, and we'd like to charge more for the good hours and less for the bad hours, and that'll benefit you and us. So I don't see any reason really why, you know, you can't just, why you all have to wait for everyone else to jump before you jump. And that would be my own take on it. I'm just going to ask our three people here, because they happen to be on stage and they're all wise people, what they think the main obstacle is to what the mood of the meeting was in terms of embarking on that journey. So just a quick line on what you would think is the obstacle that needs removing to make that journey easier. Martin.
I guess it's courage on both sides. You know, we talked about, you know, with the analogy of dancers, there's an awful lot of dancers in our industry, so, you know, the analogy of mobile phones and fax machines, I'm trying to sort of work out all the analogies, but if one person tries to do it in isolation and it doesn't have the courage on the client side, then it won't work. If, you know, one person wants to do it and one client, that's all you need. And we've already seen some case studies based on one client, one agency. But yeah, it just requires
So it's
courage.
a kind of mindset
and it
thing.
requires collaboration, because, you know, we can't in the room as agencies just work this out, just as clients can't sit down. It needs collaboration.
Mindset. Deborah.
For me, it's finance and the budget restrictions. So the cycle, the fiscal cycle, the budget setting. I had a conversation in my group about, you know, should we be thinking about next year and setting budgets in September, and maybe putting some money aside for value-based or innovation, because, you know, the finance guys, it's a 5-year plan. The marketing director cannot go over his budget. He'll get penalised personally if he goes over his budget. Finance, certainly in EE, are very close to all the marketing spend. So that, for me, is the biggest blocker. I think there's courage in the room, and there's certainly courage within a lot of the advertisers. But I think, for me, the biggest restriction is the budget.
Yeah, so I think we had kind of two things. One is quarterly reporting of big public companies. So how do you kind of quantify and amortize risk or reward over some kind of fiscal cycle that doesn't look like a 3-month idea? And then the second is for agencies culturally to be able to quantify and kind of gauge the amount of reward relative to the risk they're taking on, and then re-engineer themselves in order to kind of mitigate and manage that.
Yeah, and actually that goes back to a point which I think Caroline made very early on, that if the agencies don't have any slack or any margin at the beginning of the thing, then the idea of embarking on a journey which involves investing in anything or doing some work without immediate payment becomes an incredible impediment. Let's thank our panel, everybody. Thank you, guys.